Now, as John Curtis was saying, this campaign has been more than slightly tricky one for the pollsters, not least because there isn't a previous such referendum to compare it to. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Martin Boon from ICM and Damian Lyons Lowe from Survation. Welcome to both of you. Martin, first of all, let's look at the don't knows. We didn't get into that much detail there with John Curtis. The don't knows and those who didn't vote in the last Holyrood elections. Why does that make it so difficult for pollsters?
Well, obviously we know nothing about them. I think critical to this, and indeed to the projection that the polls are giving, is the extent to which we can be confident about the reported behaviour of people who don't know, particularly those who didn't vote in the last Holyrood election in 2011, because this is going to be an unprecedented level of turnout. So by implication, we're going to have perhaps a quarter chunk of our sample about whom we don't have any kind of voting record. Now, typically on a general election poll, for example, or indeed a Holyrood poll, we'd be able to tie back their behaviours to what we know that they did before. But since many of these people haven't voted before, we just don't know enough about them. So if these people are built in solidly to our poll samples, then perhaps, and they're telling us the truth,
yes,
then we should be okay. There doesn't seem to be a huge impact either way from what I'm looking at anyway, but again, it's just one of those black holes that we need to fill.
Right, and what sort of numbers are we talking about? Because when the polls are that close in terms of 48-52, if you're talking about, several 100,000 voters, it could result in a different outcome on the night.
Well, conceivably, the last telephone poll that we conducted for the Better Together campaign, the actual number of undecided voters was as low as 9%. When we looked at the subsample and tried to squeeze those people and say, well, if you had to vote tomorrow, would you vote? Would you say yes or no? Those voters didn't really break significantly either way. So I'm not of the view that there's a big pool of undecided voters who are ready to swing in either direction.
Right, so this idea that somehow there is a silent majority of those don't knows who will vote no, they just haven't said so far, or they've been under pressure perhaps from pollsters to say yes, is that a myth? No,
that could well be a valid argument. I think Scottish people are patriotic. It's difficult to say I'm proud of Scotland, but I also appreciate the benefits of staying in the UK. That might have some social embarrassment, potentially. So that could be a factor.
Right. I mean, is there, in your experience, a spiral of silence around this? Is there a feeling that people aren't telling you the truth when it comes? You mentioned that in your first answer. Is that the case? Is there evidence?
It's ICM's pet theory, which obviously proved true in the 1990s with regard to the nasty party, the Conservatives, when people were reluctant to admit that they were still Conservative voters. Now, the question in Scotland is, of course, the extent to which people are put off saying that they potentially are going to vote no because they feel there is some kind of undesirable social relationship there. So that's not going to be picked up in an online poll because, as John Curtis mentioned, there's no interview at present. But where there is a little bit of evidence that I've conducted myself privately, I have seen a slightly greater level of reluctance among people who tell us that they're going to vote no in terms of simply admitting that fact. Now, in a referendum which is so close to 50-50, that could be a deciding factor, but I just wish I had a little bit more evidence to underpin it.
Right. What is your reaction now after the poll that put the Yes campaign ahead?
Well, I mean, I can only really speak to our own polling. I mean, I've just looked back at our figures. We conducted 13 polls since February on this current methodology, 12 of them online and 1 telephone. We've never shown, our yes figure has been between 45 and 48. Our no figure has been between 52 and 57. Maybe we've just been lucky, but all pollsters have rogue polls now and again. But we've really not seen that much movement since February. So there's a lot of narrative out there. The media demanding low-priced internet polls, and the media, in some sense, the media are getting what the media wants.
Right.
Which is something to talk about.
Well, let's turn to you then at that point, Steve Richards. There has been a huge demand. I mean, the pollsters are under an enormous amount of pressure, and no doubt feeling that if they've got it wrong, they'll be blamed.
Yeah, and I think it has been quite difficult for them in this sense. I was up in Edinburgh the August before last, and bumped into a pollster friend of mine who said the data is absolutely definitive. You can put your mortgage on there being a no vote, and the only question by January of this year would be the margin to which that no vote would win. This August I bumped into the same pollster. he said the same kind of thing. And then recently I phoned him up, to see what he thought. He thought he'd never seen a swing quite like it in recent days and weeks. So it clearly has been a difficult one to track.
One of the problems is that there just isn't enough people in Scotland who are members of online panels to create a decent sample frame from which to draw from. So if all we're doing is saying, okay, an average panel size of people might be, say, a large one might be, say, 200,000 people. Once you've got the active amounts of people, and then you've adjusted it up by 10%, you've got the same people in Scotland being polled over and over and over again, and possibly creating a slightly self-selecting bias towards the
So
yes
some
campaign.
people will have been polled many times, you reckon?
They will have been polled many times.
Well, that is interesting. Then. Is telephone polling more reliable then than online polling in this sense?
Well, as a representative of ICM, I'd have to say that, given that we're probably the last telephone pollster standing. But look,
Survation's still standing.
Of course you are. Sorry, Damian. And long may you continue to do so.
You're sitting here, but you are
Still standing. They're all still standing.
The oddity here, however, is that the telephone methodology, the online methodology, and indeed a face-to-face poll from TNS have basically all said the same thing. So if there is a problem with any methodology, then it's a problem that we're all facing as pollsters and all methodologies are facing. It's really odd that the polls are coalescing just above the 50% mark for no. I don't understand why there haven't been more, which have perhaps dropped below 50 for that part of that campaign. There's so much going on about this referendum, I just don't understand.
So take us through your last two polls, the most recent ones. How do you explain those results then?
Guardian ICM by telephone on Friday was 51% for no. Our latest one in the Scotsman this morning is 52% for no. So, clearly they're saying the same thing. Clearly they're saying that no have the edge, but it could still be one which is too close to call. The methodologies are...
And what about the Sunday Telegraph poll?
That one used a slightly different methodology.
Right. And what were the results?
Well, it had 54 for yes.
Right. So, I mean, how do you explain that difference? I mean, that is, in a tight race, a massive difference.
Yes, it is. I think, as Damian mentioned, every polling company is going to experience something of a rogue from time to time. I'd like to airbrush it from history in that context, I think, because it just doesn't fit the patterns. And because we did it slightly differently, it was a booster sample of Scots built on a GB-wide sample. I think that probably underpins why we were slightly different on that one.
Right. How likely do you think it is, Damian, that the result will be different to the polls?
Well, to our polls, I mean, my preferred methodology is similar to Martin's. In this case, it is the telephone because of the restrictions in Scotland and the ability to have a large enough online panel to not keep asking the same people the same questions over and over again. The way we conducted our last telephone poll is we took a representative sample of individual records, then called those people, and then adjusted those people back to what are the demographics of Scotland, and that showed a 54% for the no campaign. Now, so we're not having a social embarrassment issue on the phone as far as I'm concerned.
OK, fine. Have you laid a bet?
No, I wouldn't bet on this one.
No.
But I assume in the end, I mean, the polls are nearly always right these days, so we must work on the assumption that sort of coalescing around a no win is right, but I wouldn't put any money on it.
All right, gentlemen, well, we'll find out soon enough.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.